Have you ever looked at an old photograph of yourself and felt as though you were seeing a stranger? The smile looks familiar, yet the eyes seem different, perhaps softer, or maybe more innocent. You can almost sense the quiet behind that moment, the laughter that once came so easily, the confidence untouched by hardship. And somewhere in that realization, a small voice within you admits, I'm not that person anymore. Change rarely unfolds the way stories portray it. It doesn't arrive with thunder or grand revelation. It slips in quietly between choices, in the sighs you don't notice, in the moments when you stop chasing certain people or explaining yourself the same way. Your silence, once heavy with defeat, begins to carry peace instead. Transformation isn't an explosion, it's erosion. Slow, steady, often invisible, yet constant like the tide reshaping the shore. You start noticing it in subtle ways. Songs you once loved lose meaning. Certain jokes no longer amuse you. You crave solitude not from sadness, but because something within feels sacred now, fragile and worth protecting. The world hasn't really changed, but your view of it has. Colors fade in some places, glow in others, and you wonder when the shift began. Was it heartbreak, betrayal, or a quiet night when you finally faced the truth? Psychologists call it ego death, a dissolving of the identity you once believed was fixed. Neuroscientists might describe it as neural rewiring, where emotional pain forces the brain to build new connections. Spiritually, though, it feels like both burial and birth. You grieve and awaken at once. You become the mourner and the newborn, the one who lets go and the one who begins again. It's strange, isn't it? We say we want change to grow, to become wiser, freer, but when it comes, it unsettles us, because transformation doesn't just add, it takes away. It removes the masks, strips away the comfort of familiarity. In that rawness, you're left to meet yourself again, not the version shaped by fear or approval, but the one that's always been waiting beneath it all. And then, the real question surfaces, the one echoing through every sleepless night of growth. If change is certain, what awakens it? Perhaps it begins the moment you stop fearing the end of who you were, because that's when your new life quietly takes root. Imagine a child walking softly across creaking floorboards, holding their breath to keep the peace. They've learned that silence keeps the storm away. They've learned to read the moods of those meant to protect them, to study every sigh, every slammed door, every frown as though it were a code. And somewhere in decoding others, they begin to disappear. Maybe you were that child or someone like you. You learned early that love wasn't unconditional, it had to be earned. So you molded yourself like clay, smoothing the edges that caused trouble, hiding the parts that drew too much notice. You smiled even when it hurt. You agreed even when you didn't. You became agreeable, dependable, small because safety lived inside approval. You couldn't have known then that every small compromise was forming a mask you decarry into adulthood. Psychologists call it the false self, a survival mechanism, not a defect. According to attachment theory, a child will always choose connection over authenticity, because love means survival. The child who experiences emotional distance or unpredictable affection learns to perform to mirror what others expect and suppress what they truly feel. Even the body adapts, cortisol rises, empathy sharpens, intuition becomes alert. You didn't just survive emotionally, your biology learned to survive too. But the cost of being loved was often losing yourself. You grew skilled at reading others' emotions, yet unable to understand your own. You could sense your parents' moods, but not name your own pain. You could comfort others, but not yourself. Over time, your true self, the one who once felt freely and spoke boldly, went underground, buried beneath layers of adaptation. Years later, we give it modern names: people-pleasing, perfectionism, burnout, self-doubt. But beneath all those labels is the same quiet question from childhood: will I still be loved if I stop performing? And yet, transformation never starts with pretending. It begins with breaking at the point where the identity you've built begins to collapse under its own weight, when the need for approval no longer outweighs the fatigue, when your silence becomes too heavy to bear, when the mask you've worn starts to suffocate you. That's when something deeper, something ancient, begins to awaken. The truth is, your authentic self never vanished. It's been waiting quietly, patient for permission to return. So the real question isn't who did you have to become to be loved, it's who must you become now to be free. At some point you stopped asking who you truly were, and began asking who you needed to be. That's how adulthood quietly begins, not as a celebration of freedom, but as an extension of childhood performance. Only now the stage is bigger, the stakes are higher, and the audience feels endless. Each day you wake up and put on your chosen mask. For some, it's the achiever, efficient, capable, tireless, earning affection through accomplishment. For others, it's the caretaker kind, selfless, always available, mistaking exhaustion for worth. And for some, it's the stoic calm, unreadable, unshaken believing that emotion is a weakness to be hidden. Whatever form it takes, the mask becomes a second skin, a costume stitched from expectations, society's, your family's, and your own. Eventually you forget what it felt like to exist without it. Carl Jung called this the persona, the face we show the world, carefully shaped to survive within its boundaries. It isn't entirely false. In fact, it serves a purpose. We need masks to function, to fulfill our roles, to shield what feels too vulnerable to reveal. But the danger comes when we start confusing the mask with the face, when we believe the act is our true identity. That's when life turns into a performance. You laugh on cue, love on cue, even fall apart on cue. Every reaction becomes rehearsed, every pause intentional. You stop living authentically and start performing existence. And beneath the approval, something quietly aches. Because the longer the mask stays on, the heavier it grows. What once protected you begins to confine you. It starts as armor but slowly becomes a cage. You begin to recognize the difference between being admired and being truly seen, between earning respect and being genuinely understood. Neuroscientists might explain that your brain has become dependent on external validation, the dopamine rush that comes from approval reinforcing the same neural patterns that once made you feel secure as a child. But on a psychological level, it feels simpler than that. You've built an impressive prison and labeled it success. There are moments, quiet, passing moments when the mask slips, maybe during heartbreak, solitude, or in the stillness of early morning, when you realize you no longer recognize your own inner voice. Those moments are cracks in the surface, more glimpses of the self that has been buried under years of adaptation. If you pay attention, you can sense it, a faint rhythm of authenticity waiting to return. The truth is, the mask once had a purpose. It protected the child and guided the adult. But it was never meant to be permanent. Real transformation begins not when you keep refining your disguise, but when you finally face what's beneath it. And in that confrontation, beneath all the noise of who you were told to be, the unconscious starts to awaken. Change can feel almost mystical when you're in the middle of it, as if your soul is shedding its old skin. Yet beneath the poetry, there's science at work. Every repeated thought, every familiar reaction, every time you choose comfort over courage, your brain is taking notes. It's constructing pathways of habit, carving grooves into your mental landscape. Over time, those grooves form your sense of identity. You don't just think thoughts, you become the patterns that repeat within you. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself through repeated experience. What fires together, wires together. Meaning, if you've spent a decade believing you're not enough, your brain has practiced that belief until it feels permanent. Your neurons have rehearsed the same story so many times that it now runs automatically. Struggling to change isn't weakness, it's biology. You're working against a system your mind has programmed to protect you. But here's the remarkable part. The same brain that learned fear can also learn freedom. Research on cognitive restructuring shows that with awareness, reflection, and consistent practice, the brain can trim old neural pathways and build new ones. Just like muscles, thoughts grow stronger through repetition. Each time you pause before reacting, challenge an old belief, or sit with discomfort instead of avoiding it, you're teaching your brain a new language or a new version of yourself. Psychologists describe identity as a feedback loop. Your beliefs shape your actions, and your actions reinforce your beliefs. Break even one side of that loop, and the entire cycle begins to change. It begins with awareness. Viktor Frankl once said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose." That space is neuroplasticity in action, the brief moment where a new story can begin. But neuroscience alone can't capture the deeper feeling of transformation. Carl Jung believed that true psychological growth requires integration, that to change, you must face what you've hidden or denied. The emotional truths buried in the unconscious hold the keys to genuine rewiring. Without that, change stays at the surface, an idea rather than an embodied reality. Modern trauma research supports this view. When emotions are processed and reintegrated instead of avoided, the nervous system the past stops repeating itself, the body releases its tension, and the mind begins to trust its own sense of calm. So maybe the brain is more than just an organ, it's a storyteller. One that's repeated the same narrative for so long it's forgotten that blank pages still exist. Real transformation begins not when you create a new story, but when you stop believing that every chapter before this one was the ending. Because transformation isn't just an idea you understand, it's a truth you experience. And it's in that experience that real rewiring begins. There comes a moment in every transformation when the version of yourself you once knew starts to unravel. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or sudden insight, but in quiet moments, the kind that echo behind closed doors and settle deep within you. One day, you simply notice that the world you used to fit into now feels too small, like a room whose walls close in with every breath. Conversations that once excited you sound empty. Relationships that once defined you feel distant. Even your reflection starts to look like a memory of someone you used to be. This is what mystics refer to as the dark night of the soul, the silent death of who you believed yourself to be. It's not depression in the clinical sense, though it can feel similar. It's a spiritual unraveling, the slow dissolution of identity, the fading of the false self you've worn so long that you mistook it for truth. Psychologists might describe it as ego death. The mind's struggle to cling to old narratives while the deeper self insists on freedom. You can feel it deep in your nervous system, that trembling uncertainty, that strange mixture of grief and relief, as if you're mourning the version of yourself that's fading away. The mind, wired to seek stability, panics at the first signs of collapse. It fills you with fear and confusion, convincing you that you're falling apart. But in reality, something old is being taken apart so something new can form. Neuroscientists studying trauma call this neural pruning, old connections breaking down to create space for new growth. What feels like destruction is actually a form of creation. You're not losing yourself, you're letting go of what was never truly you. Think of a garden in winter. The soil seems empty, cold, forgotten. Yet beneath the surface, unseen roots are quietly rearranging, preparing for what's to come. That's what this dark season within you is, a hidden rebuilding of your inner world. It might feel like you're disappearing, and in a way, you are. The part of you built on approval, control, or fear is dissolving, and that process hurts. The applause fades, the noise stops, and silence becomes your only companion. But maybe your sadness isn't a sign of failure. Maybe it's your spirit outgrowing its old boundaries. Maybe the emptiness isn't a void, it's a threshold. The philosopher Heraclitus once said, "The soul is dyed by the color of its thoughts." Perhaps yours is simply changing shades. The world will tell you to move on, to distract yourself, to fill the silence with something new. But real transformation doesn't rush. It stays among the ruins. Because before something new can live within you, something else must be allowed to die. Have you noticed how the world applauds when you stay the same, but grows uneasy when you begin to change? Society has an odd loyalty to consistency. It wants you to be predictable, easy to label, be reliable, they say, be stable. But what they really mean is, don't change too much, don't outgrow our comfort zone. The moment you start transforming, you threaten the illusion of order that keeps everyone pretending they're satisfied. From childhood, you're taught to protect your identity, not to question it. You pick a career path, then you're told to stick with it. You fall in love and are told not to change too much. Even your closest friends, who claim they want your best, can become unsettled when you start to grow beyond the role they've known. You were the quiet one, the funny one, the dependable one. Now you've become something uncertain, reflective, evolving, and that unsettles them, because your transformation reminds them of the stagnation they've accepted. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith, the act of deceiving ourselves, pretending we are fixed instead of fluid beings. To admit change is to admit that all stability is temporary. Marriages, beliefs, hierarchies, even the self. So society builds cages called identity and praises you for staying inside. The employee who stays 20 years in the same job is loyal. The one who leaves to start anew is reckless. The partner who sacrifices growth for comfort is devoted. The one who evolves beyond what love can hold is unfaithful. Nietzsche called it the tragedy of becoming. He believed humans fear evolution because it requires the death of certainty. To grow is to let go of what once made sense, to stand in the chaos between who you were and who you are becoming. But culture doesn't celebrate chaos, it numbs it. It teaches you to medicate your transformation with distraction, routine, and the reward of conformity. And yet, somewhere within, your spirit longs for more. You feel it when your ambitions outgrow your environment, when your conversations start to sound rehearsed, when life whispers for you to move but you remain still because no one else is moving with you. Transformation becomes a quiet rebellion. You become like a butterfly returning to a world that still expects a caterpillar. They see your wings as arrogance, your silence as distance. your growth as betrayal, but what they don't understand is that change isn't defiance, it's survival. And with that survival comes loneliness, the ache of outgrowing everything that once felt safe. No one tells you that transformation can be lonely. They talk about growth as enlightenment, but never about the emptiness that follows. When you start shedding old identities, it doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like grief. You walk through a life that no longer fits, surrounded by familiar faces who no longer see you. Conversations once effortless now feel forced. Laughter sounds like an echo from a version of you that's already gone, and in the silence that replaces it all, you ask, was the change worth it? There's a unique sorrow that comes from growth. Psychologists call it identity loss, the emotional conflict when your inner world changes faster than your outer one. Your mind clings to the past, mistaking familiarity for safety. Your old neural pathways resist being rewritten. The brain doesn't crave joy, it craves what's predictable. Even toxic comfort is still comfort. Letting go of it feels like betrayal. You start missing the wounds that once defined you, the heartbreak that gave you purpose, the chaos that gave you shape. It's strange how pain can feel like home when you've lived in it long enough. Without it, you feel bare, unanchored, suspended between who you were and who you're becoming. This is what Carl Jung meant by individuation, the painful separation from collective illusions. To become yourself, you must step away from belonging. The loneliness deepens when those around you resist your change. Friends drift away, sensing the difference but not understanding it. They miss the version of you that kept them comfortable. Growth is a quiet act of rebellion, and not everyone wants to be reminded of their own stillness. You don't blame them, but you feel the ache of walking alone, realizing that to become your true self, you must sometimes leave behind those who only loved your mask. In that emptiness, your body trembles. You reach for old patterns just to feel real again. You tell yourself, maybe I overreacted, maybe I was happier before, but that's just the echo of your old identity begging for return. Every rebirth requires a burial, and what's being buried now is the self that clung to what no longer fits. Yet, in the stillness, a whisper begins. Faint but steady, a new rhythm beneath the grief. Eventually, the storm doesn't fade because it weakens, but because you've learned how to stand within it. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes sacred. The loneliness that once hollowed you out becomes space, room for something new to grow. You realize transformation isn't about erasing your past, but uncovering what was hidden beneath it. Rebuilding begins quietly from within, not from the outside. No applause, no grand rebirth, just small, consistent choices that become strength again. You start setting boundaries, not as walls, but as lines of respect. You're right not to be understood, but to understand yourself. You meet your shadow in quiet moments, the anger, desire, and fear you once rejected, and you stop exiling them. They were never enemies, only messengers. The parts you tried to destroy were simply asking to be seen. Psychologists call this integration, the reunion of the conscious and unconscious self. Healing begins when you stop resisting your darkness, and start learning from it. Neuroscience mirrors this truth. Each time you respond to pain with awareness instead of avoidance, your brain rewires itself for resilience. New neural pathways form, ones rooted in presence, compassion, and trust. It's not about being fearless. It's about walking with fear and still choosing to move forward. And in that movement, something extraordinary unfolds. You start rebuilding yourself, slowly, brick by brick, breath by breath. You learn that stability isn't stillness, it's being grounded enough to bend without breaking. You forgive, not because others deserve it, but because your peace does. You stop chasing validation and start building meaning. And then a gentle truth appears. You were never broken, only rearranged. Transformation isn't a makeover, it's a remembering. The child who dreamed freely, the soul that once trusted life before fear was learned, they're still within you, waiting beneath the rubble. Now, with patient hands, you begin to uncover them. Each moment of awareness becomes a foundation stone. Each breath, mortar. Each act of honesty, a beam of light breaking through the cracks. You're not escaping your old self. You're guiding it home, and somewhere in that process, a whisper returns from the depths of memory. What if transformation was never about becoming someone new, but about remembering who you were before the world told you to forget? Look again at that old photograph, the one that used to make you ache. It feels different now. The person staring back no longer feels like a stranger. Their eyes, once naive, now seem gentle, understanding. You see now, they weren't weak, they were becoming. You realize that every version of yourself, every heartbreak, every collapse, none of it was an ending. It was necessary dismantling, because all life moves in cycles of death and rebirth. Change isn't graceful. It's raw, unsettling, sacred destruction. The universe itself works this way. Stars collapse to create light. Forests burn to make room for new roots. Hearts break to remind us that love isn't found, it's revealed. Nietzsche once said, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star." And now you understand. The chaos within you was never the enemy. It was the fire preparing you to rise. Jung called this individuation, the merging of your shadow, your pain, and your potential. It's not about perfection, it's about wholeness. The phoenix doesn't rise in spite of the ashes, but because of them. Transformation isn't an ascent, it's a descent into the very parts you feared to touch. The grief, the shame, the quiet truths you buried. You fall into them, and in falling, you find your wings were waiting all along. When you live with that awareness, you stop fearing the cycles. You no longer panic when things fall apart, because you see the pattern. Decay isn't death, it's the soil of renewal. The same pain that once felt like punishment becomes purification. Every ending begins to shimmer with the quiet promise of beginning again. And so you breathe. You stop running from the ruins and start building temples out of them. You forgive the versions of yourself that had to die for this one to live. You see that the cracks weren't flaws, they were openings. Every silence, every scar, every sleepless night was leading you here to this moment of recognition. You were never meant to stay the same. You were meant to evolve, to fall apart and come together again and again, until every fragment of your being remembers its place in the whole. That is the art of sacred destruction. That is the beauty of the phoenix within you, burning, rising, burning again, not to become someone new, but to remember that even in the ashes, you were always the fire.